The taxi crunched up the long gravel driveway, each turn of the wheels seeming to count out the years Marcus Thorne had been away. Through the window, the Vance Manor emerged from the soft Cotswolds mist, its ancient stone walls glowing with a honeyed warmth under the weak afternoon sun. Ivy clung to its facade like a carefully preserved memory, and the gatehouse stood like a silent, loyal sentinel. It was a picture of timeless English elegance, an oil painting brought to life, and in the crisp lines of his military uniform, Marcus felt as alien as a slash of fresh paint across a masterpiece. He paid the driver, the man's eyes lingering for a moment on Marcus's dark skin and the imposing breadth of his shoulders, before flicking back to the manor, a silent question hanging in the air. Marcus ignored it. He had grown accustomed to being a curiosity in places like this. He slung his pack over his shoulder lighter, now stripped of the tools of war, but heavy with a nervous anticipation, and walked toward the grand oak-carved door. The air was still smelling of damp earth and roses. He had only been here a handful of times during the brief whirlwind romance with Sarah before her sudden death had left a hole in his life and their daughter Maya in the custody of her stepmother Eleanor Vance. The marriage had been a union of two different worlds, his of a London council estate and the rigid discipline of the army, hers of inherited wealth and quiet, unshakable privilege. He raised his hand and knocked the sound echoing unnaturally in the profound silence. After a long moment, the door swung open. Eleanor stood there, a vision in a cream cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored trousers. Her blonde hair was swept into an effortless chignon, and she held a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her cool blue eyes. "Marcus," she said, her voice smooth and measured. The word hung in the air, weighted with surprise. "What a remarkable occurrence." "My tour ended early," he replied, his tone even professional. He had learned that was the best way to communicate with Eleanor, as if they were negotiating a treaty. "I wanted to surprise Maya." "A surprise indeed," Eleanor murmured, stepping aside. "Do come in. She's in the drawing room." Marcus stepped over the threshold and into a cathedral-like silence. The air inside smelled of beeswax, old paper, and something faintly floral. Sunlight streamed through tall leaded windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over priceless antiques. On the walls, portraits of pale-faced Vance ancestors stared down with expressions ranging from mild disapproval to outright disdain. In this house, Marcus always felt like an intruder in a history that had no chapter for him. He followed Eleanor across the polished floorboards, his combat boots a stark, vulgar intrusion on the Persian rugs. From the drawing room, he could hear a faint rhythmic sound, a soft, repetitive scrubbing. He stopped in the doorway. The scene before him wasn't what he had imagined for his homecoming. Maya wasn't playing with dolls or drawing in a book. His 8-year-old daughter was on her hands and knees on the floor, a small cloth in her hand, meticulously scrubbing at a barely visible scuff mark on the dark oak. She was so focused on her task, she didn't even notice him. Her mixed-race heritage showed in the beautiful cascade of dark curls that fell across her face, a stark contrast to her pale, delicate skin, Sarah's skin. "Maya." Marcus said, his voice a soft, gentle rumble, afraid that anything louder might shatter the fragile atmosphere. The scrubbing stopped. The little girl froze, her shoulders tensing. She turned slowly, and her wide hazel eyes, his eyes, landed on him. For a heartbeat there was nothing, no joy, no cry of daddy, no rush into his arms. There was only a flicker of recognition quickly swallowed by a fear he didn't understand. She simply stayed there, small and still clutching the damp cloth. The sight sent a cold spear of unease through his chest. He walked forward and knelt down, bringing himself to her level. The scent of lemon polish filled his nostrils. "Hey, little bird," he whispered, using his old pet name for her. "I'm home, Daddy." She breathed the word, barely audible. She didn't move toward him, her gaze darting nervously toward the doorway where Eleanor stood, watching a silent, statuesque observer. "I missed you," he said, holding his arms open. Hesitantly, she crawled forward and allowed him to pull her into a hug. Her body was stiff in his embrace. She felt fragile like a sparrow. As he held her, his hand stroked her back and his cheek brushed against her arm. That's when he saw it. Just below the sleeve of her simple cotton dress, on the pale skin of her forearm, was a cluster of angry red welts. They were small and circular, almost like tiny clustered bites, but too uniform, too deliberate. He gently pulled back his grip on her shoulders, still firm. "Maya, what's this on your arm?" She flinched instinctively, trying to pull her arm away, hiding it behind her back. "It's nothing." His soldier's instincts, honed by years of threat assessment, screamed that this was not nothing. He took her hand gently and turned her arm over. The marks were more visible now, raw, inflamed, some of them peeling slightly. His voice dropped, stripped of its earlier warmth. "Eleanor, what is this?" Eleanor glided into the room, her polite smile unwavering. She glanced at Maya's arm with an air of mild inconvenience. "Oh," that she said, her tone dismissive. "It's just a rash. You know how children with her delicate constitution can be. Prone to all sorts of dermatological sensitivities." Marcus looked from the marks on his daughter's skin to the cool, unblemished face of her stepmother. A cold certainty settled in his gut. It was a lie, a smooth, polished, expensive lie. He looked back at Maya, at the fear in her eyes that was directed not at the marks on her arm, but at the conversation itself. She was terrified of him asking. He forced a smile, pulling his daughter close again and kissing the top of her head. "Well, Daddy's here now," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Everything's going to be okay." But as he held his trembling child in the cold, silent grandeur of the Vance Manor, he knew his war was not over. A new one had just begun. This wasn't just a homecoming. It was an infiltration, and he would not fail this mission. Dinner was a lesson in quiet tension. They sat at one end of a dining table long enough to host a state banquet, the polished mahogany reflecting the crystal glasses and silver cutlery like a dark, still lake. A single ornate candelabra flickered between them, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. The silence in the room was so profound that the clink of Marcus's fork against his plate sounded like a gunshot. Eleanor presided over the meal with the effortless grace of a monarch. She spoke in measured tones, asking polite, sterile questions about his deployment. Was the climate terribly disagreeable, she'd ask, or it must be a relief to return to civilization? Each question was a subtle pinprick, a reminder of the chasm between his world and hers. He answered in short, non-committal sentences, his focus entirely on the small figure beside him. Maya ate with a mechanical precision, her eyes fixed on her plate. She cut her chicken into impossibly tiny pieces, pushing them around but eating almost nothing. She was a ghost at her own table. When Marcus tried to draw her into the conversation, asking about her favorite book or what she'd learned in school, she would offer a one-word answer, her gaze immediately flicking to Eleanor as if for approval. Eleanor would offer a thin smile. Maya is a very quiet, considerate child. She said the words meant as a compliment, but landing like a verdict. Marcus felt a coiled spring of frustration tightening in his gut. This wasn't his daughter. His Maya, the one he held in his memory, was a whirlwind of giggles and questions, a little girl who left a trail of joyful chaos wherever she went. This child was a porcelain doll, beautiful and silent and terrifyingly fragile. When the meal was finally over, Eleanor rose. "I'll have Mrs. Gable clear this away. It's Maya's bedtime. I'll take her up." Marcus said the words, a statement, not a request. Eleanor's eyebrows arched slightly, a flicker of surprise in her porcelain composure. "As you wish," she said, turning away without another word. Marcus took Maya's small, cool hand. Her room was in the west wing, a space that should have been a child's sanctuary. It was immaculate. A large four-poster bed sat against one wall, its silk canopy pristine. The shelves were lined with classic books, their spines unbroken. There were no scattered toys, no crayon drawings taped to the wall. No sign of the vibrant life of a little girl. It was as sterile as a museum exhibit. He sat on the edge of the bed as Maya changed into her nightgown. He tried to keep his voice light. "It's a big room. Do you ever get lonely in this big bed?" She shook her head, climbing under the covers and pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin. Only her wide hazel eyes were visible. "I'm not alone," she whispered. Marcus's heart gave a lurch. "Oh, who's with you?" Her eyes filled with a familiar fear. "The crawling things," she breathed, her voice so faint he had to lean closer. "Under the pillow. They come out when it's dark." The spring in his gut snapped. The crawling things. The phrase landed with the chilling weight of a child's irrefutable truth. He forced himself to remain calm, his training kicking in. "You don't spook a witness. You don't alarm a victim. What do they do?" He asked, his voice a soft caress. "They crawl," she repeated, a tear tracing a path down her temple and into her hair. And they whisper. It feels like tiny whispers on my skin. It makes me sleepy." He gently wiped the tear away with his thumb, his mind racing. Whispers on her skin, the red welts, Eleanor's lie. It was all connected. This wasn't a child's nightmare. It was a description of a real recurring event. "Don't you worry, little bird," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "Daddy's here now, and I'm not going to let anything whisper to you ever again. You have my word." He kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment, trying to pour all the love and protection he felt into that single touch. She seemed to relax under his presence, her eyelids growing heavy. He stayed until her breathing evened out into the soft cadence of sleep. He stood up, his body rigid with a cold, controlled fury. He walked to the door and glanced back at his daughter, a tiny, vulnerable shape in the vast, opulent bed. A wave of protective rage washed over him, so powerful it almost made him tremble. He stepped out into the hallway, closing the door with a barely audible click. The manor was silent again, draped in shadows. He needed to think, to form a plan. He began to walk, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the ancient runners. He found himself outside the library, its heavy door slightly ajar, a sliver of golden light spilling into the corridor. He heard Eleanor's voice, low and sharp, stripped of its polite dinner-party tone. "I am aware of the risks, Father," she said. He froze, pressing himself against the wall, his heart pounding a heavy military beat. "His sudden arrival complicates the timeline, I admit, but the specimen's progress is undeniable. The yield from the last cycle was exceptional." A pause. Marcus held his breath, straining to hear the voice on the other end of the line, but there was only silence. "No," Eleanor continued, a note of impatience in her voice. "I will handle him. He is a simple man, a soldier. He thinks in straight lines. He is not a threat to the project. It's a matter of caution, not sentiment. I have it all under control." The words hit Marcus like shrapnel. Specimen, timeline, yield, project. He backed away from the door, the ice of her words flooding his veins. His daughter wasn't being neglected. She wasn't sick. She was a specimen in a project. And Eleanor wasn't just a cold stepmother. She was a scientist, a jailer. He retreated to the shadows of the hallway, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The quiet fury he had felt earlier now ignited into a blaze. He finally had his mission objective. He had to know what the crawling things were. He had to find the proof. And he would tear this whole beautiful, rotten house down to its foundations to get it. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed one, its deep, sonorous tones echoing through the sleeping manor. For Marcus, the sound was a starting gun. He had been lying awake on a stiff guest bed, his body perfectly still, but his mind a maelstrom of tactics and terrible possibilities. He'd listened to the house settle, charting its nocturnal rhythm, the groan of old wood, the sigh of the heating system, the distant muffled footsteps of Eleanor retiring to her wing. Now, an oppressive silence had fallen, the kind that feels heavier, more absolute than mere quiet. He swung his legs off the bed, his movements fluid and economical, a ghost in the darkness. He was dressed in black sweatpants and a t-shirt, the closest he had to tactical gear. He didn't need a weapon. His senses were his weapons, sharpened to a razor's edge by years of operating in hostile territory. And this house, with its polished surfaces and ancestral portraits, had become the most hostile territory of all. He slipped out of his room and moved through the darkened corridors. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, painting the hallway in stripes of silver and black, providing just enough light for him to navigate. He moved with a practiced stealth, his weight on the balls of his feet, his shoulders brushing the wall, avoiding the floorboards he'd mentally mapped as the ones that creaked. He reached Maya's door and paused, his ear pressed against the cool, solid wood. He heard nothing but the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. He turned the heavy brass knob with painstaking slowness, neutralizing the sound of the latch clicking into place, and eased the door open just wide enough to slip through. The room was bathed in the same pale moonlight. Maya was a small lump under the duvet turned away from him. The air was still, but there was an undertone to it, a faint, almost imperceptible scent that he hadn't noticed earlier. It was metallic and slightly sweet, like old pennies and cut flowers. It was the smell of blood. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic trapped bird. He approached the bed, each step a deliberate act of will against the instinct screaming at him to turn on the lights and snatch his daughter away. He couldn't. Not yet. He needed proof. He needed to see the enemy. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen's glow seeming obscenely bright in the darkness. He shielded it with his body, tapping the icon for the flashlight and dimming its intensity to the lowest possible setting. A weak, narrow beam cut through the gloom. Kneeling beside the bed, he aimed the light at the edge of the pillow, his hand rock-steady. The crawling things Maya had said. Under the pillow. He took a deep, silent breath, and with the surgical precision of a bomb disposal expert, he lifted the corner of the heavy silk pillowcase. His breath caught in his throat. For a horrifying second, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was a teeming, writhing mass, hundreds of them. They weren't insects, not in any natural sense. They were tiny, translucent organisms no bigger than a grain of rice with soft, pearlescent bodies. And inside each one, a pulsating network of crimson vessels was clearly visible, glowing faintly in the flashlight's beam. They were engorged, swollen with the vibrant scarlet liquid they had consumed. They moved over one another in a slick, silent tide drawn to a series of near-invisible filaments woven into the fabric of a thin pad hidden beneath the pillowcase. The entire hideous ecosystem was slick with a thin, reddish fluid. A wave of pure, visceral revulsion washed over him, hot and suffocating. He felt a primal urge to recoil, to cry out, to incinerate this abomination. These things had been on his daughter, feeding on her. He forced the feeling down, channeling the horror into cold, clear focus. This was an intelligence-gathering operation. He brought his phone up the lens just inches from the squirming mass and began recording. He panned the light, slowly capturing the full extent of the infestation, the grotesque beauty of their crimson-filled bodies, the unnatural way they moved. As he filmed, the light glinted off something else, something man-made, tucked into a subtle fold of the mattress, almost completely concealed by the pillow. He shifted the beam. It was a sleek metallic object, no larger than an expensive fountain pen. It was charcoal gray with a single small indicator light that was currently dark. It looked like a piece of advanced medical equipment, an auto-injector. He reached out, his fingers barely trembling, and carefully picked it up. It was cool to the touch. At one end was a small recessed button. At the other, a cluster of microneedles so fine they were almost invisible. He understood instantly. This device wasn't for injecting something into her. It was for stimulating a reaction, for drawing the crawling things to her, for making the yield more exceptional. The cold fury inside him solidified into something dense and heavy, like a block of ice in his chest. Eleanor hadn't just neglected her stepdaughter. She had cultivated her, harvested from her, turned her bed into a laboratory and her body into a resource. He carefully placed the auto-injector back exactly where he found it. He couldn't take it, not yet. Taking it would alert the enemy that their position had been compromised. Instead, he continued his search. His training had taught him that operatives often had a fallback, a hidden cache. He ran his hand along the underside of the heavy antique bed frame. His fingers brushed against a small rectangular object taped deep in the shadows near the headboard. He worked it free. It was a small, slim power bank, the kind used to charge a phone, with a thin wire leading from it into the mattress itself. It was powering the filaments, creating the network that attracted and sustained the creatures. He recorded it all: the writhing mites, the auto-injector, the power source. He had the what. He had the how. He had undeniable, irrefutable proof. He gently lowered the pillow back into place, his movements as delicate as if he were handling a live explosive. He stood up, backing away from the bed, his eyes never leaving the placid, sleeping form of his daughter. He had seen the face of the enemy. It was not a monster with claws and fangs. It was a quiet, insidious parasite cloaked in silk and science. And as he slipped out of the room and back into the suffocating silence of the Vance Manor, he knew that he would not rest until he had burned the entire nest to the ground. The morning broke gray and damp, the Cotswold sky weeping a fine mist that clung to the manor's ancient stones. For Marcus, the gloom was a fitting reflection of his own state of mind. Sleep had been a stranger. He had spent the night staring into the darkness, the horrific writhing image from under Maya's pillow burned onto the back of his eyelids. There was no more time for covert observation. He had to act. He would not allow his daughter to spend one more night in that bed. He came down for breakfast with a new Arctic resolve. He found Eleanor in the morning room, seated by a large window, a newspaper folded neatly beside a plate of untouched toast. She looked up as he entered, her expression as serene as a winter lake. "Good morning, Marcus," she said. "Did you sleep well? Like a log." He lied, his voice flat. He turned to Maya, who was sitting opposite Eleanor, listlessly stirring her porridge. "Maya, how are your arms this morning?" Maya flinched, her spoon clattering against the bowl. She looked at Eleanor, then down at her lap. Her silence a thick, suffocating blanket. Marcus didn't wait for an answer. "The rash is worse," he stated, his gaze locking with Eleanor's. "I'm taking her to see a doctor. Today." Eleanor placed her teacup back on its saucer with a delicate, deliberate click. "That's hardly necessary. I've already applied a cortisone cream. These things take time. I'm not waiting," Marcus said. The words were quiet, but they held the unyielding weight of a command. I've found a highly rated private clinic in Cheltenham. We have an appointment at 10. A flicker of annoyance so quick he might have missed it crossed her features before being smoothed over by her usual mask of polite concern. Cheltenham. That's a bit dramatic. Our local GP, Dr. Hemlock, has known the family for years. I prefer a second opinion, Marcus cut in. We're leaving in an hour. For a moment, a silent battle waged across the breakfast table, but Eleanor, ever conscious of appearances, yielded. To argue would be to seem unreasonable, uncaring. She gave a tight, conceding nod. Very well, if it will put your anxieties to rest. The Cheltenham clinic was exactly as Marcus had pictured it, a temple of private health care. The reception area was a symphony of muted grays and expensive abstract art. Patients sat in cream leather armchairs flipping through glossy magazines, their quiet conversations barely disturbing the hushed, tranquil atmosphere. When Marcus walked in holding Maya's small hand, the conversations faltered. A dozen pairs of eyes, wealthy, white, and curious, flicked over his combat boots, his broad shoulders, his dark skin, and then to the mixed-race child at his side. He felt the familiar weight of their gaze, the silent, instantaneous calculus of class and race. He was an anomaly here, an error in their carefully curated world. A receptionist with a crisp accent checked them in. A few minutes later, a man in a flawlessly tailored suit under a stark white coat emerged. He had silver hair and a smile that was all professional polish and no warmth. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice smooth. "I'm Dr. Finch." Eleanor rang ahead. "Do come through." The examination room was as sterile and impersonal as the lobby. Dr. Finch had Maya sit on the examination table, and he glanced perfunctorily at the welts on her arm. He touched one lightly with a manicured finger, his face a mask of detached interest. "Yes, it's a form of contact dermatitis, quite common in children with sensitive skin." He announced his diagnosis, swift and final. "Likely an allergic reaction to a new detergent, or perhaps something in the garden." "It's not a rash," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "Last night I found hundreds of things, bugs, crawling under her pillow. They were full of blood." Dr. Finch's patronizing smile tightened. He straightened up, looking at Marcus as if he were a particularly difficult specimen. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his tone now laced with condescension, "I understand you've just returned from a challenging environment. Sometimes the stress of active service can cause a certain level of hypervigilance. It's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks." The insult was so elegantly delivered, it took Marcus a moment to process it. He was being diagnosed with PTSD. "I know what I saw," Marcus insisted, his anger a low burn. "Perhaps," Dr. Finch said, turning to walk back toward the door. He didn't just dismiss Marcus in the privacy of the room. He continued the consultation as he stepped out into the main reception area, raising his voice just enough for the other patients and staff to hear. It was a deliberate public execution of his credibility. "As I was saying, Mr. Thorne," he announced, stopping by the receptionist's desk. "Mrs. Vance is a highly intelligent woman with a background in biochemistry. I trust her judgment implicitly. She mentioned you were feeling overwrought." He let the word hang in the air. "This is a simple dermatological issue. I'm prescribing a stronger hydrocortisone cream." He scribbled on a prescription pad and handed it to the receptionist, pointedly ignoring Marcus. "And I might suggest," he added, his final killing blow, "that you consider speaking with a professional about managing your post-deployment stress. It can be a great help for families during the readjustment period." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, Maya's hand clutching his. Every eye in the room was on him. He could feel their pity, their judgment, their smug satisfaction. He had been publicly branded as an unstable, untrustworthy outsider, his concerns relegated to the ravings of a troubled soldier. He was nothing, and Eleanor, the lady of the manor, was everything. He grabbed the prescription from the counter without a word and walked out, his daughter trailing silently behind him. The wall was higher and thicker than he had imagined. It wasn't just Eleanor, it was her world. A world of polished surfaces and professional courtesies that could be weaponized to create a wall of perfect, impenetrable silence. He had one last hope: the school. He drove directly to the exclusive prep school, a collection of charming stone buildings set behind a wrought iron gate. He met with Maya's teacher, a woman named Mrs. Davies, in an empty classroom that smelled of chalk dust and floor wax. She was initially warm and sympathetic. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, Maya has been quieter than usual," she admitted, her brow furrowed with concern. She seems very tired in the afternoons. I've noticed her nodding off during reading time. This was it. Corroboration. Has she said anything about being scared, about not sleeping well? Mrs. Davies' open expression suddenly shuddered. Her eyes darted toward the classroom door. Well, children go through phases, she said, her voice becoming vague and noncommittal. It's a big adjustment having a new family dynamic. This isn't about a family dynamic, Marcus pressed. This is about her health. I think she's in danger. The teacher physically recoiled, wringing her hands. Oh, I wouldn't say that. Mrs. Vance is a very involved parent. She's on the school's board of governors, you know. She assures me Maya is receiving the best possible care. The message was clear. Mrs. Davies was afraid. Afraid of the Vances, afraid of losing her job. The wall was here too. Marcus left the school, the polite, dismissive words of the doctor and the teacher echoing in his head. He strapped Maya into her car seat and sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes cast down a silent witness to his complete and utter failure. He had tried to fight this war by the book. He had sought help from the designated authorities, the experts, the caregivers, and they had all closed ranks, protecting one of their own and casting him out. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. A cold, hard clarity settled over him. If the system was the wall, he would not try to break it down. He would go over it. He would call in his own cavalry. He started the car, his mind already thousands of miles away, formulating the message he would send to the one person he knew, who operated outside the polished, silent world of the English establishment. The one person who would believe him without question. The moment they returned to the manor, Marcus felt the atmosphere shift. The air, already cool, had taken on a distinct chill. Eleanor met them in the grand entryway. She didn't ask about the doctor's appointment. Her placid expression told him she already knew the outcome. Dr. Finch would have called her the second they left. She had won that battle, and her victory hung in the air between them, a silent, smug declaration. I trust Dr. Finch was able to allay your concerns, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I'll take Maya to her room. She looks exhausted from the excitement. Marcus watched her lead his daughter away. Maya's small hand lost in Eleanor's grip. He felt a surge of possessive fury but forced it down. Open confrontation was a losing strategy. He was a lone soldier on enemy soil, and his only advantage was the element of surprise. Eleanor believed she had neutralized him, labeling him as an overwrought veteran. He would use that miscalculation. He waited until he was sure they were upstairs before beginning his sweep of the ground floor. He moved with a quiet, methodical purpose, his senses on high alert. He started with the most obvious places, the study, the library, finding nothing but dusty ledgers and first editions. Then his training prompted him to think outside the box. Where do you dispose of sensitive materials in a house with a full-time staff? You don't put them in the bin for the housekeeper to find. You destroy them yourself. He found his way to the morning room, the same room where they had eaten breakfast. A grand marble fireplace dominated one wall, its grate cold and dark. But something was off. A faint, acrid smell of burnt plastic still clung to the air, a chemical ghost that no amount of potpourri could fully exorcise. He knelt, his phone's light probing the darkness of the hearth. Amongst the gray wood ash, he saw it, a small, blackened and warped fragment of a cardboard box. Most of it was gone, but one corner had survived, protected by a larger piece of charred log. He carefully retrieved it with a pair of antique fireplace tongs. On the scorched surface, a partial logo was still visible. It was an elegant serpentine V entwined with a depiction of a double helix. Below it, a few letters of the company name remained printed in a Gothic old-world font. Vance Apothecary Jean. Vance. A cold dread trickled down his spine. This wasn't some anonymous corporation. This was a family business, her family. He slipped the fragment into his pocket and continued his search. His focus now lasered on Eleanor herself. He knew he couldn't get into her private wing without raising suspicion. But her office, a place for managing the household's affairs, was on the ground floor. It was a long shot, but it was his only shot. The door was unlocked. Marcus slipped inside, closing it silently behind him. The room was the epitome of organized control. Dark wood, leather-bound books on pharmacology and cellular biology, and a large, minimalist desk holding only a sleek silver laptop and a single framed photograph of a stern-faced older man, Lord Alistair Vance, the family patriarch. Marcus didn't touch the laptop. It would be password protected and likely track login attempts. Instead, he began a systematic search of the desk drawers. The top ones held mundane stationery and household accounts, but the bottom right drawer was locked. Amateurs lock things, his instructor used to say. Pros hide them in plain sight. But Eleanor, for all her intelligence, was arrogant. He pulled a thin metal pick from the lining of his wallet, a relic from a past life he never thought he'd need in the English countryside. The lock was simple, designed to keep a nosy housekeeper out, not a trained soldier. It clicked open in under 10 seconds. Inside, nestled amongst boring property deeds, was a slim black tablet computer. It was a specialized device, thicker and more robust than a commercial model, with no visible branding. He pressed the power button. The screen lit up with a simple text-based login prompt: VAG Secure OS, Vance Apothecary and Genetics. It asked for a password. He tried the obvious: Eleanor Vance, Vance Manor, Lord Alistair. All failed. The screen flashed a warning: 2 failed attempts remaining before data purge. He stopped, his heart pounding. He had one more chance. He thought about Eleanor, her arrogance, her pride, her obsession with legacy. What was at the center of her universe? He looked at the photograph on the desk of the cold-eyed man who was her father. Then he thought of the words Maya had used. The crawling things. They whisper. It makes me sleepy. A crimson lullaby. He typed K21. The screen flickered and then unlocked. He never knew why he thought of that combination of a letter and numbers, but it worked. A file system appeared, stark and clinical. Most folders were encrypted, but one was not. It was labeled simply M-Progress Log. He tapped it open. His blood ran cold. It was a series of dated entries written in the detached, emotionless language of a scientific paper. Subject: M age 8. Genetic profile: C variant, alpha maternal, G variant delta. Paternal log entry: 0317. Subject continues to exhibit remarkable protein synthesis in response to biokinetic mite stimulation. The unique combination of her genetic heritage, the hybrid vigor, appears to be the key factor. Yield remains high. Log entry 04.02, minor dermal inflammation observed, consistent with previous cycles. Subject complains of itching. Sedative properties of the mite secretion appear effective in managing discomfort and ensuring uninterrupted rest cycles. Log entry 0415, paternal unit has returned unexpectedly. Potential for observation and disruption is high. Recommend increasing sedative dosage to ensure subject M remains placid and uncommunicative. The project cannot be compromised at this stage. Marcus had to force himself to breathe. He felt a dizzying wave of nausea. Subject M. Maya, hybrid vigor. Her mixed-race heritage wasn't just a point of social curiosity for them. It was a resource to be exploited. Paternal unit, that was him. He wasn't a father. He was a variable, a potential disruption to be managed. He scrolled down, his thumb shaking, and found video files. The thumbnails were tiny, but he could make them out. They were short clinical clips filmed in the dim, green-tinged light of a night vision camera. One showed a close-up of Maya's arm as the mites swarmed. Another showed Eleanor, her face calm and focused, attaching a small disc to Maya's skin. This was it, the entire monstrous truth. He didn't have time to copy the files. He used his phone, his hands moving with renewed urgency, and photographed every screen, every log entry, every damning word. He captured the video thumbnails and the file names. It wasn't the raw data, but it was more than enough. It was a confession. He carefully placed the tablet back in the drawer, locked it, and put the pick away. He stood up, his body trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. He looked at the photograph of Lord Alistair Vance, his cold eyes seeming to stare right through him. This wasn't just Eleanor. This was a legacy, a dark, twisted inheritance passed down from father to daughter. And his child, his beautiful, innocent Maya, was caught in the middle of it. He walked out of the office, the digital images on his phone feeling as heavy as gravestones. He now had the what, the how, and the why. The next step was to burn the entire Vance legacy to the ground. Marcus knew Eleanor would be expecting him to make a mistake. She would anticipate a clumsy, emotional outburst, a confrontation she could twist and use as further proof of his instability. He would give her nothing of the sort. He would be the calm, concerned father. He would play her game all the while preparing his own endgame. That evening, he was a model of forced tranquility. He sat through another silent, agonizing dinner. He helped Maya with a jigsaw puzzle on the drawing room floor, his heart aching with every feigned smile. He could feel Eleanor's eyes on him, watching, waiting for a crack in his facade. He gave her none. When it was time for Maya's bed, he carried her upstairs himself. He tucked her in his hands, lingering on the silk duvet, the feel of it now, a vile, repulsive thing against his skin. "Daddy," Maya whispered, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Will you make them go away tonight?" The simple, hopeful question was a knife in his gut. "I will, little bird," he promised, his voice thick. "I promise this is the last night. Just get some sleep." He kissed her forehead and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. His mission for the night had two objectives: get a live recording of the act itself, and then bring the hammer of the law down on this house. He retreated to his room and retrieved the piece of kit that had been his constant companion in the field, a micro camera no bigger than a button, with a magnetic base and a near-invisible lens. It was a simple, effective tool for seeing what lurked in the shadows. He waited another hour until the house was deep in its slumbering silence. Then he crept back to Maya's room. He moved with the silence of a predator, his every sense straining. Inside, he gently eased open a large antique wardrobe that stood opposite the bed. The angle was perfect. He affixed the tiny camera to the dark wood of the inner door frame, a single unblinking eye that had a clear, unobstructed view of Maya's bed. He ran a hair-thin wire down to a small battery pack hidden behind a stack of old hat boxes on the floor. He connected it to his phone via a secure, short-range Bluetooth signal. He retreated to his room, sat on the edge of the bed in the pitch darkness, and watched. The phone screen showed a grainy black-and-white image of his daughter sleeping peacefully. The minutes crawled by, each one a small eternity. The clock on his screen ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. He didn't move his focus absolute. He was a sniper in a hide waiting for his target to appear. At 2:17 a.m., a shadow fell across the doorway on his screen. Eleanor glided into the room. She moved with a calm, unhurried grace that was utterly chilling. There was no malice in her movements, no sign of cruelty. This was routine. This was science. Marcus's thumb hovered over the record button. He watched his blood like ice in his veins as she approached the bed. She stood over Maya for a long moment, a dark silhouette against the moonlit window. Then she gently, almost tenderly, brushed a stray curl from Maya's forehead. It was a gesture of such counterfeit maternal care that it made bile rise in Marcus's throat. She reached into the pocket of her silk dressing gown and pulled out the auto-injector pen. With a practiced clinical efficiency, she pulled back the duvet, exposing Maya's small arm. She placed the tip of the device against the skin and pressed the button. There was no sound, but Marcus saw Maya's arm twitch slightly in her sleep. Eleanor then reached under the pillow and pulled out the thin pad teeming with the now-activated mites. She placed it gently on the mattress beside Maya's arm. The effect was immediate. The creatures, stimulated by whatever the injector had released into Maya's system, began to move from the pad onto his daughter's skin. Marcus's finger stabbed down on the record button. He recorded it all. Eleanor's calm, emotionless face, the glint of the metallic pen, the grotesque sight of the mites beginning their work. After a minute, she carefully tucked the duvet back around Maya, replaced the injector in her pocket, and slipped out of the room as silently as she had entered. Marcus stopped the recording. He had it. Unmistakable, undeniable proof. He saved the file, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and triumph. The war was over. He didn't hesitate. He dialed 999. "Police, please," he said, his voice a low, tightly controlled tremor. He gave the operator the address of the manor, his name, and the nature of the crime. "I need to report a case of child abuse. I have video evidence." The response was faster than he'd expected. Within 20 minutes, the crunch of tires on the gravel drive announced their arrival. A single police car, its blue lights flashing, painted the manor's ancient walls in pulses of stark artificial light. 2 officers, a weary-looking older sergeant and a much younger constable, met him at the door. He led them into the library, the scene of the crime, feeling too sacred to be violated by this. "I'm Marcus Thorne," he began. "My daughter Maya is upstairs. Her stepmother, Eleanor Vance, has been experimenting on her." The sergeant, whose name tag read Miller, listened with a non-committal patience, his expression unreadable. Marcus played the video. He held the phone out, the grainy, horrific scene playing out in the silence of the room. The young constable's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock on his face. But Sergeant Miller just sighed. He looked from the phone to Marcus, his gaze lingering on Marcus's dark skin, his imposing frame. Sir Miller said, his voice heavy with a practiced weariness, "This is a serious accusation to make against a woman like Mrs. Vance." "It's right there," Marcus insisted, gesturing at the phone. "That's proof." "It's a blurry video taken in the dark," the sergeant countered, waving a dismissive hand. "We can't clearly see what that device is. We can't identify what those specs are. For all I know, you could be putting ants in your daughter's bed to frame her stepmother. This looks like a nasty custody dispute to me." The accusation, so calmly delivered, hit Marcus like a physical blow. "A custody dispute? Did you see what she did? I saw a mother checking on her child," Miller said flatly. "Look, Mr. Thorne, the Vances are a respected family in this community. Lord Alistair is a benefactor to the policeman's ball every year. We can't just storm in and arrest his daughter based on a grainy video, in your word. We'd need a lot more than this. A formal complaint from a doctor, perhaps." The bitter irony was a punch to the gut. The doctor was part of the wall. "So you're not going to do anything?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low. "We'll file a report," the sergeant said, already turning to leave. "But my advice to you is to sort this out with your family and your solicitors. Don't waste police time." They walked out, their boots echoing on the polished floor, leaving Marcus standing alone in the library. The blue lights outside swept across the room one last time, then vanished, plunging him back into darkness. The system had failed him. The law, which he had served and fought for, had looked him in the eye and chosen to protect the powerful over the innocent. He was nothing to them but a nuisance, a complication in their comfortable, well-ordered world. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on him. The rage and triumph he had felt were gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He had been a fool to believe in their rules, their procedures. This was not a war he could win on their terms. He pulled out his phone again. He opened a secure messaging app, one that bounced its signal across 3 continents before reaching its destination. He scrolled to a single contact, a name he hadn't needed in years, Colonel Eva Rostova. He attached the video file. He attached the photos of the tablet screen, the log entries, the scorched box fragment. He typed a short, simple message. "Eva, I'm calling in the favor. My daughter is the target. This is not a request. This is an SOS. Location attached." He hit send. There would be no solicitors. There would be no more polite requests. He was done playing their game. He had called in the cavalry, and when Eva's cavalry arrived, they wouldn't knock. They would kick the door down. The dawn that followed was tense and silent. Marcus had not slept. He sat in a wingback chair by the window in his room, watching the sun burn the mist off the manicured lawns, a silent sentinel on a lonely watch. He had armed himself with the only weapon he had left, patience. Eva's reply had come just before sunrise, a single concise sentence that spoke volumes. "Stand by. Help is en route." Downstairs, the day began as if nothing had happened. The smell of brewing coffee and bacon drifted up from the kitchen. Through his partially open door, he heard the faint sounds of the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, going about her duties. It was a terrifying performance of normalcy. He found Eleanor in the dining room, calmly reading the Times. She looked up at him, and for the first time he detected something other than cool composure in her eyes. There was a glint of triumph, a smug certainty. Sergeant Miller had undoubtedly called her after leaving reporting on the unstable veteran and his unfounded accusations. She believed she had won. She believed he was now powerless, a caged animal. "I do hope you had a more restful night," she said, the words a subtle taunt. Marcus ignored her, turning his attention to Maya, who was sitting in her usual spot, listlessly pushing a piece of toast around her plate. Her eyes were shadowed, her skin even paler than the day before. The sight of her so fragile and so defeated stoked the fire of his rage into a white-hot furnace. He had to hold it in, just a little longer. He sat down, forcing himself to eat, to play the part of the beaten man. He needed her to feel secure. He needed her to be here when the world she had so carefully constructed came crashing down. They were finishing their silent, joyless breakfast when the sound began. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable thrum of multiple heavy engines. It was a sound that did not belong in the tranquil Cotswolds countryside. Eleanor frowned, lowering her newspaper. Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of confusion. "Madame the housekeeper began, there are Vehicles coming up the drive. Marcus stood up, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, steady rhythm against his ribs. It was time. He walked to the large bay window that overlooked the front of the manor. Eleanor followed, a look of mild irritation on her face. What she saw made her composure crack. It wasn't the police. 3 unmarked matte black Range Rovers were pulling to a stop on the gravel driveway, their movements precise and coordinated. They were followed by a larger, windowless white van. Doors opened in unison, and a dozen figures emerged. They wore simple, dark tactical gear, no police logos, no flashy insignia. They moved with an efficiency and purpose that was utterly alien to this place of inherited leisure. They were professionals. What is the meaning of this? Eleanor breathed, her voice tight with disbelief. This is private property. As if in answer, the heavy oak door of the manor burst open with a splintering crack, the ancient lock giving way under the force of a battering ram. The lead figure, a tall, severe-looking woman with short dark hair and piercing eyes, stepped across the threshold. She was dressed in the same tactical gear, but carried herself with an air of absolute command. It was Eva Rostova. She scanned the grand hall, her eyes missing nothing before they landed on Marcus. A flicker of recognition, a curt nod. Her gaze then shifted to Eleanor, and her expression became one of pure, cold steel. Eleanor Vance. Colonel Rostova's voice was sharp, clipped, a weapon in its own right. I am Colonel Rostova, National Biocrime Directorate. You'll be coming with us. Eleanor stared, her face ashen. The mask of aristocratic grace shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. You have no right. I'm Lady Vance. You can't just... Save it! Eva cut her off, gesturing to 2 of her team members. They moved forward, flanking Eleanor, their presence an unspoken, immovable threat. Simultaneously, the rest of the team swept through the house. Men and women in white hazmat suits began to emerge from the van, carrying sealed cases of equipment. They moved with a chilling, silent purpose, their actions a stark violation of the manor's hallowed quiet. The girl Eva said to Marcus, her tone softening fractionally. Upstairs, West Wing, he replied, his voice hoarse. Eva nodded to a woman with a medic's insignia on her arm who immediately headed for the stairs. Eleanor, seeing her world being dismantled before her very eyes, finally found her voice again, a shrill, desperate cry. You can't prove anything. It's his word against mine. He's an unstable, violent man. Eva didn't even look at her. She raised a tablet computer she was holding, the screen glowing in the dim light of the hall. We don't need his word, she said, her voice dropping, each word a hammer blow. We have the log files from the Vance apothecary servers. We have the procurement orders for the biokinetic mites. We have the encrypted notes from your father, Lord Alistair. And she added, turning the tablet so Eleanor could see, we have this. On the screen, the grainy video Marcus had filmed was playing, Eleanor's own face calm and clinical, attaching the device to Maya's sleeping form. A strangled gasp escaped Eleanor's lips. She stared at the screen, her face a rictus of horror and disbelief. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. She finally understood. She hadn't been fighting a lone, broken soldier. She had been fighting a ghost with connections to a world far more ruthless and powerful than her own. She had miscalculated on a catastrophic scale. Secure her, Eva commanded. Before Eleanor could scream or struggle, her hands were pulled behind her back and secured with a zip tie. She didn't fight. All the arrogance, all the pride had evaporated, leaving only a hollow, trembling shell. Marcus watched, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sense of release. He turned as the medic came back down the stairs, carrying Maya gently in her arms. She was awake, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, clutching a teddy bear Marcus didn't recognize. He rushed to her side. It's okay, little bird, he whispered, stroking her hair. It's over. Daddy's here. Maya looked from his face to the chaos unfolding in the hall, to the sight of Eleanor being led away, a silent, defeated figure. Her lower lip trembled, and then she buried her face in the medic's shoulder, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Get them out of here, Eva ordered, her voice a low command to Marcus. Take my lead vehicle. There's a secure medical facility waiting for her. Marcus nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He helped the medic carry his daughter out of the house, past the teams in hazmat suits, who were now sealing off Maya's bedroom as a biohazard zone. As he stepped across the splintered threshold and into the gray morning light, he didn't look back. The legacy of the Vance Manor was now a crime scene. His only concern was the future, and it was nestled trembling in the arms of a stranger, finally on its way to safety. The secure facility was less a hospital and more a fortress of sterile white science. It was an underground complex, a place that didn't exist on any public map, accessible only by a long concrete tunnel that hummed with the sound of industrial-grade air filtration. The transition from the ancient ivy-covered stone of the manor to this world of polished steel and biometric scanners was dizzying. Maya was immediately taken to a biocontainment suite, a glass-walled room at the heart of the facility. A team of doctors and specialists in full hazmat gear descended on her, their movements a blur of controlled urgency. Marcus was relegated to an observation chamber separated from his daughter by a thick pane of reinforced glass. He stood pressed against it, his palms flat on the cool surface, his knuckles white. He felt utterly helpless, a soldier stripped of his weapons, a father unable to offer comfort. He watched as they hooked Maya up to a dizzying array of monitors. Wires and tubes seemed to sprout from her small frame, connecting her to machines that beeped and flashed in a complex, terrifying rhythm. Her vital signs were displayed on a large screen above her bed: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, core temperature. The numbers were a foreign language to him, but he could understand the frantic tone of the specialists as they called them out. For the first hour, things seemed stable, terrifying, but stable. Eva stood beside him, her presence a silent, solid support. She explained what her team had pieced together. The mites weren't just extracting, she said, her voice a low murmur. They were part of a feedback loop. They secrete a chemical stimulant that forces the subject's body to overproduce a unique protein complex. A protein your daughter's specific genetic makeup creates under duress. That's the yield they were harvesting. The problem is, her body has been in a constant state of producing and fighting this stimulant for months. Now that the stimulant has been withdrawn, she didn't need to finish. The shrill, piercing wail of an alarm cut through the air. On the monitor, Maya's heart rate spiked erratically before plummeting. Red lights flashed across the screen. Acute systemic shock, a voice from inside the room shouted, distorted by the intercom. Her body is attacking itself. It's a cytokine storm. We're losing her. Marcus's blood ran cold. He watched in horror as Maya's body arched on the bed, a violent, uncontrollable convulsion seizing her tiny frame. Her skin, already pale, began to take on a horrifying mottled bluish hue. The red welts on her arms, which had been fading, suddenly flared up, turning a deep, angry purple. Pressure is crashing. Administering epinephrine. No response. She's going into cardiac arrest. Get the defibrillator. Marcus slammed his fist against the glass, a raw, guttural roar of anguish tearing from his throat. Eva grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. Steady, soldier. They're doing everything they can. But they weren't. Inside the room, the scene was one of controlled chaos. They were treating the symptoms, fighting a battle on 100 fronts without knowing the nature of the war itself. A silver-haired man, the lead physician, Dr. Aris, turned from the bed and spoke into the intercom. His voice strained. Colonel, the toxin, or whatever it is, has bonded at a cellular level. We can't filter it out. Her immune system is in a state of catastrophic hyperreaction. It's destroying her from the inside out. We're out of options. No. Marcus breathed, shaking his head, his forehead pressed against the glass. No, there has to be something. Dr. Aris looked at him, his eyes filled with a grim sympathy through the clear panel of his helmet. Her immune system is the weapon, he said, and we can't disarm it. Eva's mind, always processing, always searching for an angle, suddenly locked onto the doctor's words. The weapon, she repeated under her breath. She turned to Marcus, her eyes blazing with a sudden, desperate idea. Marcus. The logs. They mentioned your genetic profile, the paternal G variant Delta. They said her immunity was tied to her hybrid vigor. Your DNA is half of her code. Dr. Aris's head snapped up. What are you suggesting, Colonel? Her immune system is out of control? Eva reasoned, the theory forming even as she spoke. What if another compatible immune system, the one hers was derived from, could introduce the right antibodies? Not to fight the toxin, but to neutralize her own response, to give her body the stand-down order. It was a wild, unprecedented long shot. A transfusion of whole blood was too slow, too crude, but a direct transfer of concentrated lymphocytes, the command and control cells of the immune system. It's theoretically possible, Aris admitted, his voice crackling with a new urgency, but incredibly risky. His immune cells could be rejected, triggering an even worse reaction, graft versus host disease. It could kill her faster. It's a chance, Marcus said, turning from the window, his face a mask of desperate resolve. It's the only chance we have. Do it." There was no time for deliberation, no time for paperwork. Aris gave a curt nod. "Prep the adjacent suite for an apheresis transfer. We need to match his blood type and run a rapid compatibility screen. Now." The next few minutes were a blur. Marcus was rushed into a connecting sterile room, his uniform torn away and replaced with hospital scrubs. A nurse, her face hidden behind a mask, expertly found a vein in his arm and drew a vial of blood. He lay on a gurney watching through the glass as the medical team fought to keep his daughter's heart beating. They were using chest compressions now. The rhythmic rise and fall of her small chest was a sight of such profound violence and desperation that he had to look away. He stared at the ceiling, every tick of the clock a hammer blow against his soul. He was a man who had faced death a dozen times, who had walked through firefights and minefields. He had never known fear, not like this. This was a helplessness so absolute, so suffocating that it threatened to crush him. "We have a match," a technician called out. "Blood type is compatible. And the human leukocyte antigens." "Colonel, you were right. The paternal markers are a near-perfect sequence lock. He's the key." A wave of relief so potent it left him dizzy washed over Marcus. He wasn't helpless anymore. He was the weapon. They wheeled his gurney into the containment suite, a flurry of activity surrounding him. A large complex machine was set up between his bed and Maya's. A thick needle was inserted into his arm, another into the opposite. His blood began to flow out, a dark, rich river of life into the whirring, clicking machine. "Apheresis is underway," Dr. Aris announced, his voice tight with concentration. "We're separating the T cells and the natural killer cells, the cavalry." Marcus looked over at his daughter. Her eyes were closed, her face a serene bluish-purple mask. The chest compressions had stopped, but the long, continuous beep from her heart monitor told him why. Her heart had given out. "We have to get the cells in now," Aris commanded. "There's no time." A clear bag began to fill with a pale, straw-colored liquid from the machine, his immune cells concentrated and pure. The nurse connected the bag to a line running directly into Maya's central venous catheter. "Infusion has begun," she said. Marcus watched the pale liquid drip, drip, drip down the tube and disappear into his daughter's still form. He felt his own energy draining away, a profound weariness seeping into his bones. Go on, he thought, his consciousness starting to fog at the edges. Fight for her. Do what I can't. Fight. He closed his eyes, his last ounce of strength fading. He was giving her his army, his very life force. As darkness threatened to envelop him, he heard a shout from one of the doctors. "We have a rhythm. Sinus rhythm. It's faint, but it's there." A moment later, the flat line on the monitor blipped. Once, twice. Then it settled into a slow, steady, miraculous beat. Beep, beep, beep. It was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. His daughter's heart was beating again. His cells had reached her. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time the enemy was in retreat, while Marcus was waging a biological war for his daughter's life. Eva Rostova was launching a conventional one. The data seized from the manor and the Vance apothecary servers had painted a grim, terrifying picture. Lord Alistair Vance wasn't just funding the project, he was the lead architect, and his primary laboratory wasn't in some high-tech corporate park. It was hidden in plain sight, a parasitic growth latched onto a symbol of innocence. "St. Jude's Hospital for Children," Eva said, briefing Marcus 2 days later. He was sitting by Maya's bedside watching her sleep. The purple mottling on her skin had faded. Her breathing was steady, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic. She was weak, but she was alive. It was a flagship Vance philanthropic project for decades. They shut it down 10 years ago, citing funding issues. But they never sold the property. Alistair converted the entire subterranean surgical wing into his private lab. Marcus looked up from his daughter's sleeping face, and the weariness in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard fire. "When do we go? My team is moving in tonight," Eva said. "It will be a quiet surgical entry. Alistair doesn't know we're onto the location yet. We need to secure the research, the assets, and any other subjects." The word hung in the air, heavy and monstrous. Other subjects. "I'm going with you," Marcus stated. It wasn't a question. Eva studied him for a long moment. She saw the exhaustion, the raw trauma of the past few days. But underneath it, she saw the soldier focused, determined, and fueled by a righteous fury that was more potent than any stimulant. "Gear up in 20, she said, and walked away. Darkness had fallen over the city, a thick blanket of cloud smothering the moon. The abandoned Saint. Jude's hospital was a hulking Gothic silhouette against the bruised sky, its windows like vacant staring eyes. Marcus, dressed in the same black tactical gear as Eva's team, felt a grim sense of homecoming. The familiar weight of the body armor, the solid feel of a sidearm holstered at his hip, it was a skin he had shed, now forced to wear again. They didn't storm the front gates. An advance team had already secured a service entrance in the rear, cutting through rusted chains with silent thermal tools. They descended into the belly of the building, a maze of decaying corridors that smelled of dust decay and the faint antiseptic ghost of its former life. The entrance to the lab was hidden behind a false wall in a derelict boiler room. Two guards, hired muscle in cheap suits, were neutralized with swift, silent efficiency before they could even raise an alarm. Eva's hand signals directed the team, a silent, deadly ballet in the darkness. They breached the door. The contrast was jarring. One moment they were in a decaying industrial space, the next a state-of-the-art laboratory. Rows of humming servers lined one wall, their blinking lights reflecting off sterile stainless steel surfaces. Glass enclosures held writhing cultures of the biokinetic mites, and at the center of it all, a man with a shock of white hair and the cold, arrogant eyes from the photograph stood over a bank of monitors. Lord Alistair Vance. He looked up, not with fear, but with a flash of pure aristocratic rage. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here? It's over." "Alistair," Eva said, her voice calm and deadly. Her team fanned out, securing the room, their weapons trained on the handful of lab technicians who froze like startled deer. Alistair sneered. "Over." "My dear woman, you have no idea what you're interrupting. This is work that will redefine immunology." He turned back to his console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "But you won't get to see it. A pity." "He's wiping the servers," a technician on Eva's team shouted. Marcus moved. He vaulted over a lab table, shoving a panicking scientist aside. He was a force of nature, a single-minded missile of retribution. He was meters away from Alistair when a figure stepped into his path from a side office. A younger man with the same aristocratic features as Eleanor, but with a haunted, broken look in his eyes. Julian Vance, Eleanor's brother, Alistair's son. "Stay back," Julian said, his voice trembling. He wasn't looking at Marcus, he was looking at his father. "Julian." "Get out of the way, you useless boy!" Alistair roared, his finger hovering over the final enter key that would execute the data purge. "No," Julian whispered. He looked at Marcus, then his eyes filled with a profound, gut-wrenching shame. "No more." While Alistair's attention was diverted, Marcus lunged. He didn't go for Alistair, he went for the hardware. With a powerful wrench, he tore the central server's main hard drive from its housing, a shower of sparks erupting from the severed cables. The monitors all went black. Alistair let out a scream of pure fury and lunged at Marcus, but before he could reach him, Julian stepped between them. "It's finished, Father," Julian said, his voice gaining a strength Marcus hadn't thought he possessed. He reached into his own jacket and pulled out a small encrypted external hard drive. He held it out to Eva. "This is everything. The primary backup, the offshore accounts, the list of investors, the profiles of the other children." Alistair stared at his son, his face a mask of utter betrayal. You would betray your own family, your own blood." "What family?" Julian's voice cracked and a single tear traced a path down his pale cheek. "The one that tortures children for profit. The one that turned my sister into a monster and used my niece as a lab rat. That's not a family. It's a disease." He looked at Marcus, his gaze direct and filled with a desperate need for absolution. "I'm sorry. I was a coward. I knew parts of it and I did nothing. My family caused this. It's only right that one of us should be the one to end it." It was a confession and a surrender, a profound, meaningful act of rebellion against the legacy he had been born into. Eva took the drive, her expression unreadable, and nodded to her team. "Take him into custody." As they led Lord Alistair away, snarling and spitting curses, a small, whimpering sound came from a locked room at the back of the lab. Marcus's head snapped towards it. While Eva's team secured the scene, he moved to the door. It was a cold steel soundproof door. He kicked it open. The sight inside ripped the breath from his lungs. 3 small children were huddled together on a single mattress on the floor. They were pale, rail-thin, and wore simple gray tunics. And on their exposed arms and necks were the same angry red welts he knew so intimately. They flinched at the sight of him, their eyes wide with the terror of caged animals. He immediately dropped to one knee, holstering his weapon, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. He held up his empty hands. "It's okay." he said, his voice a low, gentle whisper. "My name is Marcus. We're here to take you home. You're safe now." One of the children, a little boy who couldn't have been older than 6, looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. Are you one of the doctors?" he whispered. "Yes." Marcus lied without hesitation, his heart breaking. "I'm one of the good ones." He reached out slowly, and the little boy, after a moment's hesitation, took his hand. His tiny fingers were as cold as ice. Marcus felt the last of his own anger drain away, replaced by an overwhelming, aching sorrow. He had come here for revenge. He had found a rescue mission instead. He looked at these small, trembling faces, and he saw his own daughter. He had torn down the serpent's lair not just for Maya, but for them all. The fall of the House of Vance was not a quiet affair. It was a media firestorm, a detonation at the heart of the British establishment. Eva Rostova's directorate, armed with the irrefutable evidence from Julian's hard drive and the horrific reality of the rescued children, did not leak the story. They orchestrated its release with military precision. It began with a single explosive article in The Guardian, complete with redacted documents, and a grainy long-lens photograph of Lord Alistair Vance in handcuffs. The headline was stark and brutal: "The Vance Legacy Philanthropy Poison and the Children Used as Medicine." The story ignited. News vans camped outside the gates of the now sealed Vance Manor and the abandoned St. Jude's Hospital. Tabloids screamed with lurid headlines about vampire aristocrats and blue-blooded monsters. Pundits on television debated how such a sickness could fester for so long, hidden behind a veil of old money and philanthropic prestige. The name Vance, once a synonym for respectable inherited power, became a mark of shame. Marcus watched it all unfold from the sterile quiet of the medical facility. He shielded Maya from it completely, keeping the television off and the news feeds on his phone silenced. His world had shrunk to the 4 walls of her recovery room, and that was all that mattered. The storm raging outside was just noise. The legal proceedings were swift and merciless. Lord Alistair Vance, faced with overwhelming evidence, remained defiant to the end, ranting in the courtroom about his genius and the ignorance of lesser minds. He was found guilty on multiple counts of illegal human experimentation, grievous bodily harm, and kidnapping. The judge in his sentencing called him a cancer on the soul of the nation. He would die in prison. Eleanor, prosecuted separately, presented a different picture. Her defense attorneys tried to portray her as a victim of her father's coercive control, a daughter twisted by a lifetime of psychological manipulation. But the cold, clinical entries from her own logbook and Marcus's chilling video told a different story. The jury saw not a victim, but a willing and meticulous accomplice. She was sentenced to 25 years, her face a blank, emotionless mask, as the verdict was read. She never once looked at Marcus. Julian Vance became a key witness for the prosecution. His testimony was a quiet, devastating indictment of his own family. On the stand, he was a ghost, a man hollowed out by guilt and complicity. He spoke of a childhood steeped in the language of genetic superiority, of dinner-table conversations about yields and specimens that he had been too weak and too afraid to question. He didn't ask for leniency. He seemed to crave punishment. But his cooperation, his meaningful act of contrition, as the prosecutor called it, earned him a suspended sentence. His true penance, however, was self-imposed. True to his word, Julian systematically dismantled what was left of the Vance empire. He liquidated every asset sold, every property, every share, every piece of antique furniture. The vast fortune, tainted by the suffering of children, was poured into a single massive trust fund. It was named simply the St. Jude's Restoration Fund. Its purpose was twofold. First, to provide lifelong comprehensive care, medical, psychological, and financial, for every one of his father's victims, including Maya. Second, to fund ethical, transparent medical research with a board of directors made up of the world's leading bioethicists. It was a desperate, monumental attempt to wash a bloodstain from his family's name. Marcus received a formal, handwritten letter from Julian. It wasn't an apology. The words were too small for the crime. It was a confession, a statement of profound regret, and an offer of whatever resources Marcus and Maya might ever need. Marcus read it, folded it, and put it away. He couldn't find it in himself to forgive Julian, not yet, but he understood the man's brokenness. The other 3 children from the lab were recovering in the same facility in a separate wing. Marcus went to visit them once they were stable enough. He didn't wear tactical gear or a uniform. He wore a simple pair of jeans and a soft sweater. He didn't bring them toys or platitudes. He just sat with them. He read them a story. He listened as they spoke in hesitant, broken sentences about the bad doctors and the hurting medicine. He became a quiet, steady presence in their fragile new world. They didn't know his story, and he never told them. To them, he was simply Marcus, the man who had opened the door, the good one. Eva visited him one last time before the case was officially closed. They stood in the corridor looking through the glass at Maya, who was sitting up in bed drawing in a coloring book. "You're a hero, you know," Eva said, her voice unexpectedly soft. "The media wants to talk to you. They want to put a face to the father who brought down an empire." Marcus shook his head, his gaze never leaving his daughter. "I'm not a hero," he said. "Heroes don't let their little girls get hurt in the first place. The guilt he knew would be a scar he would carry forever. The only thing that matters is in that room. I'm just her dad." Eva nodded, understanding completely. "The fund Julian Vance set up is legitimate," she said. "They've offered to relocate you. A new house, new identities, anything you need to feel safe. To start over. Start over." The word sounded like a foreign language, a concept from a life he couldn't yet imagine. But as he looked at Maya humming softly to herself as she colored a bright yellow sun, he knew he had to try. For her. The aftermath was over. The cleanup had begun. And for the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to think about what might come next. They chose Cornwall, a place where the land met the sea in a dramatic windswept embrace, a world away from the manicured, claustrophobic stillness of the Cotswolds. The St. Jude's Restoration Fund, administered by a team Julian had appointed, secured them a small, whitewashed cottage perched on a cliffside overlooking the Celtic Sea. It was modest and unassuming, with blue shutters and a garden overflowing with unruly, salt-tolerant flowers. It was perfect. The first few months were a quiet negotiation with a new kind of peace. The silence here wasn't the oppressive, watchful silence of the Vance Manor. It was a living, breathing silence filled with the cry of gulls and the eternal rhythmic sigh of the waves. For Marcus, a man conditioned by the rigid schedules of the military and the hypervigilance of his private war, the sheer unstructured emptiness of their days was a challenge. He had to learn to simply be. He became a student of his daughter's recovery. He watched as the color slowly returned to her cheeks, as the shadows of fear receded from her eyes. He learned the landscape of her trauma, the way she would flinch at the sight of a needle on a television show, or how she would sometimes wake in the night, her small hand reaching out in the darkness to make sure he was there. He had moved a single bed into her room, placing it against the opposite wall. It wasn't about protecting her from a physical threat anymore. It was about protecting her from the ghosts. It was a silent promise that she would never be alone in the dark again. Their days found a gentle healing rhythm. They walked the coastal paths. Maya's small hand tucked firmly in his, her laughter finally starting to sound less fragile, more like the carefree music he remembered from long ago. They explored tide pools, discovering tiny resilient creatures clinging to the rocks. "Look, Daddy," she'd exclaim, pointing at a starfish. "It's holding on so tight." Marcus would smile, a lump forming in his throat. "We are too little bird," he'd think. "We are too." He cooked for her simple, nourishing meals that were a world away from the formal, soulless dinners at the manor. They ate at a small wooden table by the window, watching the fishing boats bob on the horizon. They were relearning how to be a family, not in the shadow of a grand, rotten legacy, but in the warm, honest light of their own small kitchen. One afternoon, about 6 months after their arrival, Maya came to him with a drawing. It depicted two stick figures on a cliff. One was large, the other small. They were holding hands, and above them a bright crayon yellow sun smiled down. "What's this one called?" he asked, his voice gentle. Maya looked at her drawing with a serious expression. "The Captain and the Starfish," she said. "The Captain and the Starfish," he repeated, a smile touching his lips. "Why that?" Because she explained as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're the captain, you keep our boat safe. And I'm a starfish, because I learned how to hold on tight." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her dark curls, his shoulders shaking with an emotion too profound for words. The title she had given him was a greater honor than any medal he had ever received. He was no longer the paternal unit, a variable in an equation. He was the captain. He never lost touch with the world he'd left behind. He maintained a secure, encrypted correspondence with Eva, who kept him updated. The other 3 children were all in safe therapeutic homes, their healing a long and difficult road, but a road they were now on. He also maintained a professional distant contact with the administrators of Julian's fund. He didn't want their money for himself, but he worked with them to direct resources towards grassroots organizations that protected vulnerable children, becoming a silent, anonymous force for good. He used his unique, painful experience not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a shield for others. One clear, star-dusted night, he and Maya sat on a blanket in their small garden, leaning against the cottage wall, looking up at the infinite glittering canvas of the sky. She was 9 years old now, her face beginning to lose its childish roundness, her eyes bright with a curiosity that had finally blessedly overcome her fear. "Daddy?" she said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet of the night. "Do the stars whisper?" The question, so innocent, sent a fleeting cold echo of the past through him, but it was just an echo. It had no power here. "I think so," he replied, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "But they don't whisper scary things. They whisper old stories about heroes and monsters and faraway galaxies. They whisper promises that even when it's very dark, there's always light." She snuggled closer, her head resting on his shoulder. "I like those whispers," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "I love you, Captain. I love you too, my little starfish." He whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "More than all the stars in the sky." He sat there for a long time after she had fallen asleep, his daughter's steady, peaceful breathing, a gentle rhythm against his side. Out beyond the cliff's edge, the sea rolled on, vast and deep and mysterious. The waves crashed against the shore, washing away the footprints of the day, making everything new again. In his arms, his daughter was safe. He was not a soldier anymore, nor a victim of a cruel conspiracy. He was just a father, a captain of a very small boat navigating by the light of a single brilliant star. And that was everything. That was all that had ever truly mattered.